And as a moderator, I'd like to thank the Elcano Royal Institute. I feel very at home here, and I would refer to Fernando Renard and Carola Garcia Calvo. And I'd like to thank the American Embassy also for its participation. I'm very happy to moderate this panel with 4 experts, Mr. Thomas Renard, who's the Senior Research Fellow at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations, Hilla Weizman, Major Assistant to the Head of Intelligence Division in the Israeli Prison Service, Jose Luis Lopez Novo, Head of the Intervention Service at the General Secretariat for Penitentiary Institutions, and Manel Roca, Head of Information and Security Penitentiary Services in the Department of Justice in Catalonia's autonomous government. I'm happy to be the moderator here and not be subject to the questions that will have to be answered. I'd like to discuss what to do and how. We're talking about prevention of radicalization. The next table will be talking about actions inside penitentiaries with regard to radicalization. As was stated in the previous panel, the de-radicalization is essential. Fernando, Carola, and Alvaro and Jose Luis specified that it's important to have individual attention because there are inmates who are in a situation of personal crisis, religious crisis, they're frustrated, victimized, feeling victimized, and this makes them especially vulnerable. But also, as Professor Renard has pointed out, they are very useful to recruiters and to terrorist organizations who find in them the possibility for obtaining new capabilities and new recruits for their organizations. All of these special characteristics of this issue in prisons means that prevention is essential. And at this panel, we have the challenge of trying to respond from different perspectives to the question of what to do and how to do it. I'd like to give the floor now to our first participant, our first speaker. He will talk about the possibilities for actions and how to carry them out.
Todos.
Thank you. In Belgium, we would say good afternoon, but here you still say good morning. I want to thank the Elcano Royal Institute, to Fernando, to Carola for her invitation. I'm going to be speaking in English because my Spanish is not very good. I don't want to speak poorly. And so please use your headsets. And I'll be going into English.
Point that I wanted to make is the fact that radicalization in prison, including in Belgium, is not a new phenomenon. We've seen this before. On this picture you can see a guy, some of you may know and remember him. His name is Nizar Trabelsi. He was a former professional football player. He was convicted to jail in the 1990s for drug use and drug trafficking. He radicalized in prison, then left to Afghanistan, trained with Al-Qaeda, came back just after 9/11 with the intent to conduct a terrorist operation in Belgium against a US military base in the northern part of the country. He was arrested, jailed, and not only did he radicalize in prison, but also clearly was a very influential figure in prison. We do not know, we cannot really measure all the influence he had in prison, but all we know by former inmates, by penitentiary staff, was that he was someone that was very much looked up to by other inmates. So again, this is something that we have experienced, and as a matter of fact, it's something that goes even much further in history than this. Tomorrow we celebrate King's Day in Belgium, and actually 116 years ago, in 1902, Our king was almost killed by an anarchist terrorist, an Italian, sorry Lorenzo, Gennaro Rubino, who actually also radicalized while in prison in Italy. That's where he met another terrorist, anarchist, who introduced him to the socialist utopianism and also to the anarchist ideals and tactics. He was someone who had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for bomb attack. And it's based on this radicalization and following this radicalization that Gennaro Rubino eventually moved on and decided that he had to act on behalf of anarchism and tried to kill our King Leopold II, but did not succeed. Even though this is not something that is entirely new, it's something that is much more acute than ever before. You may recognize on this picture Salah Abdeslam on the left side, not necessarily because he's someone who radicalized in prison in the first place, but rather to illustrate this new generation of jihadis, a number of which did indeed radicalize in prison, but also, and more importantly, because we have much more terrorist convicts and radicalized individuals than ever before in prison in Belgium, again, than at any other point in history. But also there is another event, another fact actually. Well, the picture on the right is Benjamin Herman. You may remember earlier this year, in May 2018, there was an attack in Liège, in Belgium, where this young man was just released. He was actually on a penitentiary leave and did conduct an operation, an attack, which he claimed was on behalf of ISIS, but obviously this is always slightly delicate. But he was allegedly radicalized in prison on a penitentiary leave, conducted this terrorist operation. But obviously this also raised a number of questions, including the issue of what is radicalization in prison, which actually links to the broader question of what is radicalization. In the case of Salah Abdeslam, for instance, it is interesting to notice that he did not, for as far as we know, radicalize in prison, but according to his lawyer, he is now further radicalizing while in prison. So this is still something else, but something of utter importance. In the case of Benjamin Herman, he was not on the radar. He was not known for radicalization before prison. He was not known for radicalization while in prison. So he's someone who's totally escaped the attention of our security services. And somehow, when he left, he did conduct this attack on behalf of ISIS. But this does raise, nonetheless, a number of questions, as for many attacks, as to whether this is really a terrorist attack. How committed was he really? How linked was he to the group? How much of a true believer was he really? These are all the questions that we have to deal with any potential terrorist, including in prison. So the same question that we're raising outside of prison are being raised in prison as well. So the question that we are asking and raising in this context, when we're dealing with radicalized individuals, is whether these individuals radicalized before they entered prison, and if that is the case, what is going to be their behavior, their attitude while in prison? Are they going to radicalize? Are they going to try to radicalize other inmates? Are they going to further radicalize themselves? Again, think of the case of Salah Abdeslam. He's someone who was obviously participated to the Paris attacks, but to the best of the knowledge of our services, he was not someone who was, and I know it sounds a little bit weird, but ideologically he was not very much radicalized. He had a very scant knowledge of Islam. But now it seems that while in prison, he's spending all of his time in the books. So he is ideologically radicalizing. And then there's the other category of those that are radicalizing in prison, who were not radicalized before entering. And the question is, what is their motive? Why are they radicalizing? We know that in prison there is a trend, a tendency for people to turn to religion. This is something very common. But in some cases, they may turn to radical Islam. They may turn to a more problematic form of religion. But some of them may also turn to the most powerful group, a group that can provide with security, with protection, with support, including for getting these little daily needs that you have in prison. And one of these powerful groups these days is the terrorists or the jihadis in prison. They have become a powerful group, one that you can turn to. And the question is, there's a lot of petty criminals that now seem to be turning and getting closer to these clusters of jihadis. But the question is, are they really committed to ISIS, to the ideology, to the jihadi ideology, or is it just convenient? And when they exit, they will try to cut that bridge as quickly as possible. Those are questions that we are dealing with when talking about radicalization in prison. And I have to say also, last point in this one, we have to distinguish when it comes to radicalization in prison between, same way as we do outside of prison, we have to distinguish between cognitive radicalization and behavioral radicalization. So are these individuals radicalizing in prison, radicalizing ideologically and ideologically only, but not necessarily meaning or wanting to become terrorists afterwards, or are they radicalizing behaviorally, so therefore turning into violent extremism and therefore becoming a threat for the society upon their release? Again, these are two different tracks that we know of in terms of radicalization outside of prison, and these are two different tracks that are also occurring while in prison. Now, we heard earlier in the first panel that there are three categories of inmates here in Spain, categories A, B, C. In Belgium, we have four categories, A, B, C, D. These are the types to watch when it comes to terrorist convicts or potential terrorists. We have, obviously, the terrorist convicts, so those that have been convicted for terrorist acts. We have people that have convicted for criminal acts, but in connection with a terrorist case, so people that have been condemned for falsification of papers, for weapons trafficking, and so on and so on. They've been condemned on the basis of criminal act, but they are linked to terrorist networks. We have a third category, which is the one for foreign terrorist fighters and returning foreign terrorist fighters. We have a number of them. And then we have a fourth category for those that are deemed to be radicalized, and those can be people that entered prison as already being known for being radicalized, but convicted for petty crime often. And there are also those that are in prison and are known for having radicalized in prison. And in terms of numbers and figures, it's interesting that we have two different figures, actually. One comes from the Ministry of Justice and the Penitentiary Administration. The other one comes from our intelligence services. They use two different methodologies. But the first thing to know is whatever the figure that you look at, again, this is without precedent. So this is a phenomenon that has reached a scope that we have never seen before. So according to the Ministry of Justice, there are 240 individuals in prison that belong to these four categories that I mentioned. According to our intelligence services, we're talking about 450. The approximate figures are as follows: about 50 terrorist convicts, about 100 foreign terrorist fighters, among which about 50 returnees. It may sound weird that we have only 50 returnees out of 100 FTF. The reason is because we also have people in prison that are considered as FTF even though they have not managed to leave the territory. Those are the ones that we prevented from leaving the territory. This is why we have this discrepancy of numbers. We have about 40 people that were convicted as criminals but linked to terrorist networks. And then the difference between the two big figures, 240 and 450, is actually coming from the difference between those that we consider as being radicalized. So according to the Minister of Justice, there are 50 individuals, about 50 individuals that are considered as radicalized in prison, but according to intelligence services, it is a much higher number. So there you have a discrepancy between those two figures. One point that I want to highlight nonetheless is that we have over 10,000 prisoners, inmates in Belgium. So even if you take the higher and the highest figure of these two, this problematic population still represent at most 4.5% of the total prison population. So it is a phenomenon that is without precedent, but still we shouldn't, I mean, we always have to be careful when we're looking at these issues. We have sometimes this magnifying effect that we have sometimes the issue, particularly if you read the newspaper on a daily basis, that radicalization in prison is something that is rampant, and sometimes some people have the impression that everyone is radicalizing. No, we're still talking of 4.5% of the prison population, something that is always and also important to keep in mind. Now, what is the response? How did we in Belgium deal with this phenomenon? The first actually strategy that actually deals with this was the 2006 Plan on Radicalism, which is a little bit of not our counterterrorism strategy, because Belgium does not have a counterterrorism strategy, but it's an action plan against radicalism and radicalization. The first one was published in 2000, well, not published, but was produced and adopted in 2006. It included 7 axes. It does focus on the vectors of radicalization, and one of these axes was prison. And there was, as a result of it, a cooperation agreement that was concluded between our intelligence services and the penitentiary administration to monitor the phenomenon of radicalization in prison. However, the fact is that between 2006 and 2015, prisons were not considered as a priority by our security services in terms of radicalization. So not a lot of efforts, not a lot of resources were invested in monitoring actually radicalization in prison. There was the training, particularly training of the prison wardens and of the psychological staff that occurred, but only 150 members of the penitentiary administration were trained by the security services with regard to radicalization. 2015 was actually the key date, the milestone for a lot of things actually, when it comes to counterterrorism and counter-radicalization in prison, including when it comes to dealing with radicalization in prison in Belgium. The second plan, Radicalism, Plan R, was adopted in 2015. And again, prison is one of the priorities, one of the axes of this new plan. But as a matter of fact, as of 2015, prisons became much more of a priority for our intelligence services. There was also, in addition to this, a strategy specifically dealing with radicalization in prison, which created a number of elements of priorities and measures to deal with radicalization in prison. So within the penitentiary administration, we did create CELEX, which is Cell for Extremism, which is a special cell at the central level of the administration that centralize all the information about radicalization in prison, about individuals, and decide on tailor-made measures to deal with these individuals. It is in the context of that strategy that Belgium also opted for its regime with regard to radicalized detainees, which is a regime of separation. That is to say, we try to separate all these inmates across different prisons, across different units, so that they do not have a negative influence onto one another, but 2 special units were created. We call them DRADEX, for de-radicalization of extremism. And there are 40 places available in those 2 units where we can put the most problematic inmates. And by problematic, we mean those that are really trying to engage in recruitment activities. Then we can put them in those special units where they are completely isolated in very high security regime with very tight monitoring, etc., etc. We have also improved the info flux between the penitentiary administration, intelligence services, police, the Central Fusion Center on threat analysis, and so on and so on. And in the strategy, it was also presented a binary approach of disengagement and de-radicalization. So the idea was to work with these inmates both on their behavior, disengagement, and both on their ideology, that is de-radicalization. However, since 2015, this approach has changed and disengagement has been completely favored over de-radicalization, and this is also based on exchanges with other countries, other services, reaching the conclusion that de-radicalization was not particularly effective, and it was rather more worth investing in disengagement. We have also developed more training. Now all the penitentiary staff has been trained to deal with radicalization. We have also adopted new tools such as Vera 2, which is a risk assessment tool for radicalized individuals, etc., etc. So a lot of things have been put in place, but this is something that is still recent and to a large extent still in the making. And I'm reaching my conclusion already. And in conclusion, I would like to highlight perhaps some of the criticism that are still being made with regard to the current approach, but also some of the positive elements that emerge from this approach. Some of the criticism, well, disengagement, which has been favored over de-radicalization, is still in its infancy, and by this I mean that the programs are not very solid yet. And actually, not all terrorist convicts and radicalized inmates have access to it. One of the reasons is that there is a tendency to opt for too much security with regards to these individuals, whereas normally the regime is one of ordinary detention, separation. Actually, we notice that on the ground, the decision of the penitentiary administration very locally is often to opt for very, very tight security measures, which is contrary to the spirit of the strategy. And when they are completely detained under such security measures, they cannot have access to this engagement program. And this is what I mean by counterproductive. So we are very afraid of the risk they pose, we are very afraid of what they could do, and therefore we deny them access to all these programs that are meant to turn them and to facilitate their reinsertion. De-Radex units also are criticized, and notably we are currently under review by the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism while respecting human rights. And she has visited prisons, she has visited de-Radex unit, and one of the criticisms that she's voiced, which is one that I've heard elsewhere as well, is that the criteria for those detainees that we send to these very special units, de-Radex, the criteria for entering there are not very clear. So there is not a clear methodology as to why certain detainees go there. Officially, it is because these terrorists are engaged actively into proselytism, into recruitment, but there does not seem to be a very clear methodology, and perhaps even more worrying, there is not a clear mechanism for taking them out of these de-Radex units. So there is a danger that once a decision is taken to put them in such units, they will never get out. So this is one of the key criticisms that was also raised by the UN Special Rapporteur. And a fourth and last criticism is with regard to reinsertion. The disengagement is one thing, the other thing is reinsertion program, making sure that these inmates are ready for once they exit to go back to the society. You have to also realize that most of them, the vast majority of these detainees are condemned to very short sentences, on average 3 to 5 years. And so if we do not work intensively on their disengagement and reinsertion during the very short lapse of time we have, there is a risk indeed that they go back to their life as it was before, which is exactly the environment in which they radicalized in the first place. So we have to be very careful to that, and that includes cooperation, also very tight cooperation between the penitentiary staff and outside services, local police, also local social preventive de-radicalization officers from the municipalities, etc. This is not yet happening in the case of Belgium. So this transition between prison and after prison is still highly problematic in Belgium, like actually in many other countries. Now for a little bit of optimism as a final point to this presentation. Well, as I have highlighted, prisons have now become a priority, so a lot of work is being done to deal and to address radicalization in prison, even though a lot of things are still in the infancy. There is a much better information position of the penitentiary administration and the intelligence services with regard to radicalization. We know much more of what's going on in prison than we did in the past, and information is also flowing much more effectively between the various services, including through a common database that has been established for information to flow between all of these services. Disengagement, there are some signs of disengagement. It's very hard to measure, there is no methodology, but it seems that when it comes particularly to foreign terrorist fighters, we are noticing positive evolutions and signs of disengagement already while in prison, and also, and most importantly, after prison. For all those that have returned from Syria and Iraq so far, but you could also argue that this is just a matter of time, but so far none of them has been caught in recidivism. So there is, this is something relatively positive, encouraging. Obviously, these individuals are very tightly monitored, both by police and security services, but also by social municipal services. That may also explain why they are not going too quickly and too openly into terrorist activities, because they know that they are being watched. So this is also obviously something that we have to take into account. But most importantly, only a very small fraction of these terrorist convicts are openly and I would say, very openly still engaged, and this is particularly those still in prison, into terrorist ideology and terrorist activities. And final point, the context, and this could also partly explain why we see a positive evolution when it comes to disengagement. The context has changed. Now we are in 2018. The radicalization is still there, is still rampant in Belgium, but it's not as high, as active as it was in 2012, 2013, 2014. So when these individuals get out of prison and go back to their neighborhood, yes, they may be very charismatic individuals, but they may not find the same echo than they may have had in 2013, 2014. One of the reasons being the fall of the caliphate, the evolution of the situation in Syria and Iraq. So again, this is something positive. Now, this doesn't mean that these individuals will not go back to jihadi activities. This doesn't mean that there is still rampant radicalization. So we have to be very careful, because another jihadi mobilization may happen, but for the time being, the fact that this context has changed is again a positive thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for telling us what is happening in Belgium, and also the question that is still open, that are continuing to be asked, and I think we're continuing to learn in different countries. I'd like to give the floor now to Hilla Weizman.
2 weeks after I got promoted to major, and a few days before the Jewish New Year, and then realized that this is the first time that the inmates see me as a major. This surreal situation that may surprise a lot of people, and even me sometimes, It's completely natural for us. As an intelligence officer, I spend hours and hours with those inmates, especially with their leadership, so it's only natural that they will be the first one to notice my new rank on my major. Even the staff didn't notice. So, there are almost 6,000 terror-related inmates inside the Israeli prisons. They are being held completely separate from the criminal inmates and does not have any rehabilitation programs whatsoever. Half of them are Fatah affiliated, that together with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, are running the Palestinian Authority. Another figure that surprises even Israelis is that only a quarter of those inmates are Hamas affiliated. I would like to talk about two more figures. One of them is the relatively high number of the unaffiliated inmates. This is a direct result of the lone wolves attacks that Israel experienced and still is since October 2015. We are talking about young people that acted on their own and emphasize on the fact that they are not related or affiliated with any other terror organization. One of the reasons is the disappointment from those organizations and from the Palestinian Authority, and their feeling that they are not active enough. Another figure is ISIS. We have approximately 80 ISIS inmates that are only 1% from the entire terror-related inmate population, but having said that, it is important to say that this number has increased a lot over the years and it still is increasing. 88% of those 80 inmates are Israeli citizens, which is also a new phenomenon that we had to deal with. The majority of the terror-related inmates are Palestinians from the West Bank, mainly from the Ramallah district, as you can see. 7% are from East Jerusalem, and about 300 are from the Gaza Strip. About 1,500 inmates are sentenced for more than 15 years. 558 of them are sentenced to life in prison. Each one of them has the power and the ability to plan terror attack from within the prison, especially soldier kidnapping that might lead to a prisoner exchange like we had in 2011, or to cause an escalation in the national security in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. Our main challenge as an intelligence is to make those 1,500 inmates feel like they have something to lose. And by that, to reduce their motivation to act and prevent them from radicalize themselves or even worse, radicalize others. We must prevent a situation whereas the prisons are another battlefront for the state of Israel. We have enough. How do we do that? Mainly by collecting intelligence. The intelligence in the IPS is human-based, but we also collect intelligence in other methods such as SIGINT and operational intelligence. We have between 2 to 5 intelligence officers in every prison, depending on the prison size. And above that, we have the district intelligence officers and his assessment officers. And above it is the intelligence division, which is responsible for presenting the intelligence evaluation on the national level. We also have a special team that's responsible for operating agents, staff, or inmates, okay? And a special unit called DROR unit, which is a special operational unit under the intelligence division that act based on intelligence information on issues regarding to drugs and cell phone smuggling. Like any other organization, we also take security measures in order to prevent radicalization. Such as restriction of visits, dividing inmates in special wings, supervision of substance like TV, books, newspaper, letters, and more. But our most powerful and valuable weapon as an intelligence is dialogue. Hours and hours of conversations, whether revealed or confidential, with sources or with the organization's leadership. The Israeli prisons are like a microcosmos, if you like, of the Palestinian society, a reflection of the Palestinian society, due to the major conflicts between Fatah and Hamas since 2006. The inmates from those organizations are living separately from each other. Aside from this division, they're also divided by places of origin. The inmates are choosing their own leadership in a completely democratic election every 6 months. So you can basically say that the Israeli prisons are the largest Arab democracy in the Middle East. Every organization chooses a representative, usually an inmate that speaks Hebrew well, and a leader. Those two are responsible for any connection with the staff and for representing the inmates in front of the IPS staff, starting with the guard in the wing, the intelligence officer, and even the prison warden. During those conversations, we learn a lot about the Palestinian society. We collect information about the terror organization inside and outside the prisons, about the way they act and make decisions. This dialogue helps us to identify the extremist factor that we would like to keep separate from others, versus the moderate factors, the moderate inmates which we would like to cooperate with. A good example is the way that we dealt with ISIS inmates, and I see a lot of resemblance to what I heard before from my colleagues here. We divide those inmates into 3 groups. The first group is the really hardcore ideologists, the real Salafist, the real religious one, a very tough group. The second group are inmates that left to fight in Syria and Iraq and came back. And the third group are youngsters that decided to join ISIS just because they thought it was trendy, cool, or just needed to belong somewhere. They have no religious knowledge whatsoever and have a criminal orientation. Our human sources were the one that detected for us the radical, and we separate them from the others. Then we found out that it is more beneficial to integrate the second and the third group inmates into the secular organization wings rather than the radical, rather than the religious ones. We integrate them with moderate Fatah inmates that were happy to cooperate with us against what they perceive as a mutual enemy. After going through a process of de-radicalization inside the Fatah wings, we involved the Israeli security agent, the Shin Bet, and those inmates signed an official document that they are no longer associated with ISIS or affiliated with it, and that they are no longer engaged of any ISIS activity inside the prison and outside. But this dialogue has another really important effect. It is a catalyzer for de-radicalization processes inside the prisons. Those conversations create really one-of-a-kind opportunity for a Palestinian to meet the other Israeli, not the soldier on the checkpoint or the Shin Bet investigator, but an IPS staff that treat him with respect and take him to get medical care if needed. They're getting to know the Israeli society and understanding that this conflict has much more shades than black and white. They learn Hebrew, like we learn Arabic, and they watch Israeli television. Think how powerful it is to watch a media coverage on a terror attack from the other side, to see the victim's family. Many times inmates approach me, especially in terror attacks where children were killed, and told me that this is not the right way to end this conflict. Whenever a problem occurs inside the Israeli prisons, we sit down and we solve it by dialogue. Those simple actions causing a bigger and more profound understanding that problems between Israeli and Palestinians can be resolved by mutual understanding, respect, and dialogue. A study conducted inside the Israeli prison in 2013 by Dr. Sagit Yehoshua, an Israeli terror researcher that worked a PhD at King's College in London, state that there are 3 main factors for de-radicalization inside the Israeli prisons. The first one is acquiring education. The second one is the length of time in prison. And the third one, and most meaningful one, is what Dr. Yoshua calls taking leadership roles and communication with the others. Most of the inmates take this understanding with them when they release out of prison, and we can only hope that they will spread the message. It is important to stay in this point that most of the leadership inside the prison is likely to have position of power outside when they release out of prison. A good example is the current Hamas leadership in the Gaza Strip that composed mostly from released inmates. Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, shown here in this photo, spent 24 years inside the Israeli prison before his release. In a prisoner exchange in 2011, Sinwar speaks Hebrew fluently and understands the Israeli society. We can see it in the way that he makes decisions regarding to this conflict. I would like to end my presentation with a video that shows an interview with Khalil Abu Khashia, a Fatah inmate who was sentenced to 15 years for attempting murder and was released just last February. Khalil was a part of Fatah leadership inside the prison and is now a part of the Fatah leadership outside. He spent a lot of time with us, the intelligence, the Israeli staff. Please listen to what he has to say only a few hours after his release from prison in the middle of celebrations that the Fatah threw out for him. Should I help? The last one. This one, yes. This is the slide.
صحيح في إمكانية لخلق جسر سلام بينه وبين الإسرائيليين بلا تجربة بالسجن، لأني أنا داخل السجن يعني اشتغلت دوبير فوق، والشيء اللي أنا شفته والشيء اللي أنا عشته في إمكانية لوجود ناس بالطرف الإسرائيلي يريدون السلام.
Conclude alongside with the classic tools of intelligence collection which we operate inside the prison, such as UMINT, the use of advanced technology and cooperation with other intelligence agencies. We also use dialogue with the inmates being organized group with unique features and power, for better or for worse. We use this model to try and achieve de-radicalization as a strategic destination for the State of Israel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hilla, for presenting what Israel is doing to prevent radicalization in prisons. I'd give the floor now to Jose Luis Lopez Novo. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity that has been given to me by the Elkanah Royal Institute to participate in this seminar. I will begin my presentation with a summary of the historic experience of the Secretariat General for Penitentiary Institutions with regard to inmates that belong to terrorist organizations, and then we'll give a description of the risks and the challenges in the penitentiary institutions, the goals that we have set for ourselves, and the strategy and the measures we have implemented to deal with these risks and to achieve our goals. The Secretary General for Penitentiary Institutions has long experience acquired over 40 years of dealing with inmates belonging to terrorist organizations, mainly ETA and Grapo, and the international terrorism began at the beginning of the 80s, when we had the first inmate in the prison that was convicted for terrorism, jihadist terrorism. And in 2004, we had the March 11th attacks in Madrid, and this was when penitentiary institutions decided to determine a strategy to prevent radicalization processes in our penitentiary institutions. It established initial intervention strategies aimed at strengthening the anti-terrorist measures, focusing on observation of behavior, attitudes of the different inmates that we had in prison. And this was to detect the possible proselytism or recruitment of inmates, and also to determine or identify other inmates that might present indicators of being individuals initiating a radicalization process through their personal situation, their social exclusion, or and for the first time, these three groups were established, that was referred to by the Secretariat General this morning, and a series of actions were designed to deal with these issues. This is based on the fact that prevention requires the evaluation of an integrated strategy for the information and intelligence services. In 2008 was when the penitentiary institutions created the first units, specific units aimed at the recruitment and analysis, or the gathering and analysis of information, and this was called the groups of control and monitoring. Two specific areas of activity were identified. First was the monitoring of inmates that we had already identified as terrorists of jihadist terrorism, and also homegrown terrorism. And a second area, which was the prevention, arrest, and monitorization of the jihadist radicalization process. We published a manual for the detection and control of radicalization processes in prisons, and it was updated in 2010. And this was through the contributions by the National Center for to fight terrorism. This is basically the responsibility of the prison officials to observe the indicators to identify this threat. We were one of the first countries in our environment, and perhaps the first, to develop this initiative, and it was facilitated at the time by the countries that were requesting this of us, facilitated to these countries. In 2011, there was a new instruction, and it regulated the file of inmates to be particularly monitored. This covered the inclusion of, in this file, the inmates who, although they were not convicted of terrorist crimes, they were outstanding because of their radicalization and attempts at recruitment. And then we had a group, these became Group B, and they were regulated. Based on that, in 2014, we implemented a new program to prevent radicalization in prison establishments through Instruction 8/2 2014, which updated and reviewed and modified some of the measures that we had been implementing up to then, along with the profiles of the inmates that we're including in groups A, B, and C. This instruction visibilized the prison phenomenon, which was really unknown by a great segment of public opinion. In this instruction, the main objective was set as the gathering, analysis, and systematization of a group of data and variables to be able to detect and deal with incipient processes of radicalization. These data were extracted from interaction with terrorist inmates, with other inmates, through monitoring of their relations with the outside, both oral, written, and telephone communications, and through any other attitude or behavior that would indicate practices of risk. All of these aspects, periodically, the institution does this on a weekly basis, but the prisons submit to penitentiary institutions all information dealing with so that the measures can be taken to deal with this radicalization or risk minimalization. After consolidating this process of identification and intervention, we developed a framework for intervention and treatment of ideological radicalization processes to help these inmates overcome the principles based on their original ideology, so that they will respect and abide by the law of the land. This program, in this afternoon, a colleague of mine will be dealing with this. In February of this year, 2018, Penitentiary Institutions has undertaken, through its service order, has developed an instrument for evaluation of violent radicalism in order to detect and evaluate the different variables that the inmates included in groups A, B, and C, or any other inmate, might present as, which would make them into a risk of violent radicalization. And now I'll talk about the risks to be neutralized through penitentiary policy. As we have stated through the different speakers, the penitentiary system can become an area where people who are prone to violence may seek to proselytize or radicalize and recruit other members of the inmate population. First, there's the possibility for extremist inmates already classified as such through their ideology, and they are in prison because of terrorist crimes, may carry out the proselytism, radicalization, and recruitment. Also, the attempt at cohesiveness amongst these inmates in one prison or in various prisons, and the initiation or continuation of relations between prisoners arrested in the same operation or in different police operations, or the attempt to neutralize the fact that these inmates throughout their imprisonment may seek to continue to focus on the criminal activity that they were engaged in prior to their incarceration by maintaining contacts with the outside. Other risks that we have to deal with is the possibility that there may pressure groups may be formed in our prisons that seek to pressure or coerce other inmates, and the possibility that these groups may plan and develop ways of fighting within the prison system to undermine our security, the order, and the alteration of the peace. And therefore, preventing other inmates from de-radicalization or disengagement. And also, there may be attacks against the physical integrity of our inmates, or seeking to alter the relations in our penitentiary system with groups outside or with organized crime groups. In talking about what to do or how we act to neutralize these risks, the first general objective is to prevent the recruitment of new terrorists through prevention, detection, and intervention within the possible radicalization processes that could take place in penitentiary institutions through detection and neutralization. The specific objectives would be to neutralize the potential radical subjects categorized as such through the criminal activity, and detect, identify, and neutralize these people, and identify the variables involved in the radicalization risk. To detect, identify, and neutralize the inmates that were sent to prison for other crimes that could become radicalizing agents, either because they showed that profile prior to entering prison, or because during their time in prison they became radicalized. As an example of these cases, without saying the name, this would be one of the inmates who recently was involved in the Escribano operation. This is an inmate since 2004 who we have subjected to special monitoring. He was sent to prison for murder based on gender violence, and we were able to identify him as having a radicalization process. Another way is to identify radicalization risk variables in inmates who might be receiving direct influence or nefarious influence in prison. Another objective is to preserve the order, the security, and the relations within the presence, to promote the participation of extremist inmates in treatment programs, to promote respect for our democratic way of life, and to deactivate religious fanaticism as a source of violent radicalism, which can also prevent them from going on in this way outside the prison system, and further try to deactivate religious fanaticism through a moderate interpretation of their religion, and also try to continue and improve the coordination and cooperation with the law enforcement by providing them with better information to enable them to monitor these individuals both inside the prisons and when they are released. How do we deal with these risks and intend to achieve these objectives? First, one of the basic premises of this strategy is through a system of dispersing these inmates, which involves distributing them amongst many different prisons through proper identification of these inmates with regard to inmates who belong to terrorist organizations, either in order to classify them, in order to limit their relationships and the activity of these inmates in relating with others, to carry out more monitoring of these inmates throughout their stay. And also there has to be adequate separation of these inmates, locating them within the same prison. To carry out this first pillar, it's obvious that we need a modern, secure system of penitentiary institutions, of our 69 prison institutions, that enable us to carry out this strategy. Another of the fundamental pillars in our strategy is human resources. These need to be well trained with special training and information to enable them to perform their duties as efficiently as possible, and as well as possible. And this is all done through observing these individuals by the penitentiary authorities, and they then detect changes in behavior and attitudes, physical appearance, activities, interaction with other inmates, and also through searching and body searches to detect extremist material or which are or publications or audiovisual materials, photographs, etc. Which another basic pillar, as I said before, was controlling the communications of these inmates. First, control and monitoring the people who communicate with these individuals, with the relations that exist between them, and secondly, in this area, the intervention into tapping of these communications to detect codes or threats or data being transmitted that can endanger our penitentiary or the prison itself or the inmates themselves. And finally, to promote, update, and evaluate specific intervention and treatment programs seeking to counteract extremist attitudes that could promote the spread of these attitudes in the prisons. The implementation of this strategy over the years, we consider, has provided optimum results and we have evaluated two indicators. One is the repeat offenses of these inmates when they are released from prison, and another is the level of conflict within the prisons themselves, which we can classify as irrelevant vis-a-vis the type of incidents in which these types of inmates were involved in. From 2014 to 2018, we've only recorded 14 incidents in which these inmates were involved, that have led to any type of aggression or injury of prison workers. As conclusions, based on what I've said previously, I can say that if the prison system is not the main focus of violent extremism or radicalization, but they can become an area for radicalization to take place. If we do not deal with these processes taking place in our prisons. We have to continue to improve and update our procedures, our intervention policies, both in security and also to detect our weaknesses and to promote and improve our strengths. The training of our professionals, as I said before, and other speakers have also referred to, is one of the major pillars that we have to meet future threats, and it's necessary, therefore, for us to strengthen our training plans, both specific and in general, to have our professionals be able to deal with their responsibilities effectively. We are adapting to this phenomenon and also adapting to the possible resurgence of other types of radicalizations. The effective fight against terrorism and violent extremism requires cooperation and coordination of all of the agencies involved, and international cooperation is very relevant to enable us to successfully deal with the challenges in this area. The person who has been involved in a terrorist act, or the prevention of a person who has been involved in an attack and been released from prison is quite the success. And we are working with the countries in our environment to deal with the terrorists themselves and to talk and in regard to infrastructure and coordination of all of the penitentiary systems. And I'd like to refer specifically to the day-to-day work of our staff, especially those that are part of the groups that control and monitor inmates, and these are basic in our organization to the detection and neutralization of these procedures or these processes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. Let's move on to the last presentation of this roundtable. As you know, Catalonia has penitentiary powers devolved to it, so it's very relevant for Catalonia to tell us how they're organized and what they do there. Manel. Thank you very much to the Real Instituto Elcano for this invitation. We cooperate very frequently, and I want to thank them for having invited us. Many of you might not know this, but Catalonia is the only region in Spain with powers in the area of penitentiary policy. We have the same organic law, and the regulation is the same as for the rest of Spain because we don't have legislative powers in that area, but we do have organizational powers, which means that all the programs, the way the staff is organized, our management models, or our organizational models, they are all designed by us. This is a small penitentiary organization. We have 8,500 inmates, 10 penitentiary centers, which are close to each other, and that means that we can manage information in a more direct manner. We have our own penitentiary organization, as I was saying, and that means we can take part in international fora. And I would like to acknowledge the work of the Central States Penitentiary Administration. When we travel abroad, we see that the information provided by other countries, well, the information is very sound, but we don't get the same quality of information that we get from the authorities in Spain in the fight against terrorism. And we have to acknowledge that Catalonia doesn't have much experience in combating terrorism because we haven't had a lot of ETA groups active on our soil, and we haven't worked directly against terrorism or with convicts, terrorist convicts. And that's because of how the state is organized. As you know, it's the court in Madrid, the Audiencia Nacional, which tries terrorism cases. And in spite of the fact that Catalonia is one of the regions in which there have been more anti-terrorist operations, the people arrested and involved in those terrorism actions are in prisons that are under the purview of the central government administration. After they've been sentenced, if they have family in Catalonia, they're transferred to Catalonia, but that doesn't happen often. I would like to acknowledge that work, however, because we feel that the experience of the central government in this area is very sound, and I say it so proudly. We're not the same organization, but we think that if in Europe there is a penitentiary organization that is well prepared to talk about radicalization, that would be the Spanish organization. Prison and recruitment and radicalization, all those processes are similar in penitentiary systems, but not social realities. So our penitentiary model is different from the models you see in other countries, and we've designed it based on our problems and our needs. Our model to combat radicalization is based on the following. We have personal factors when there's radicalization, situational factors, and a lack of protective social factors. This is a classical model. It's used in the UK to combat terrorism, and we thought this could be adapted to the way we work. So situational factors, of course, the presence of an extremist ideology and people who are influential. Personal factors, vulnerability, the vulnerability and the ability to be influenced, and the lack of protective social factors. Those factors are present in prison. You have the personal factors, especially when you arrive in prison. There is an identity crisis. There is a need to change. Access to religion is a way for inmates to change, and that doesn't only happen with Muslim inmates. It happens also with other inmates. It's something which happens in prison. There's a personal reflection, a need to change, and so on. Another situational factor is the fact that in prison, the inmate who arrives in prison, there are groups that are culturally close to the inmate, which exert pressure. And people tend to group based on cultural identity. Here we don't have separate areas for different cultures, but they do come together in cells, of course in religion and in different activities. And of course, inmates are uprooted from their families. In Catalonia, in our prisons, 44% of inmates are foreign. And that's a very high rate. And 32% of those foreign inmates are Muslim, approximately. So that would be around 14% of our inmates who are Muslim. Many of them don't have relatives. What do we see recently? We've seen young people who come to Europe, unaccompanied minors. This type of young inmate that receive the protection of the social service may commit a crime, and they have no relatives in Spain, so they're totally vulnerable. And based on this idea, we've built our model. What are the international recommendations of what a penitentiary system should be like to address radicalization? We've summed up the RAN work. You've seen that network. You know what it is. I'm sure you work with it. And I'd like to thank Angel for his cooperation, because that enables us to attend those meetings. We also have the recommendations coming from the Council of Europe and the UNODC recommendations for the UN Agency for Organized Crime. General recommendations are always the same. Penitentiary systems to combat violent extremists require a fair penitentiary system, and that's obvious to us in Western Europe. But even in Western Europe, some people question this fair penitentiary system, and the Council of Europe, through its human rights monitoring body, has called into question what certain countries do. Then we need a safe environment. The penitentiary system needs to be safe. But the safety we provide shouldn't be a system based on total control. We need a dynamic system where the prison worker interacts directly with the inmate. We also need to promote constructive relations between the staff and inmates. Staff training is key here. And then we need a balance between discipline and meeting the needs of inmates. Total control systems where security is the only element only lead to violence, and in radicalization processes, well, that system is more a breeding ground for radicalization. It's also important to strengthen the pro-social links of the inmates with their social network, and if they don't have a social network, there should be volunteers. There should be volunteers coming in, and if possible, Muslim volunteers. There need to be intervention models. In all international recommendations, this is key, because opportunities are very important. And not all inmates who are being radicalized are terrorists. It's a process. So let's provide opportunities so that they don't become terrorists. There needs to be a preventive context, and there needs to be de-radicalization processes. I think I'm going to have to get new glasses. International recommendations promote prevention and reintegration. So preventive action, assessment and specialized intervention, and social reintegration, and early detection. This is the theory. Let's see what we do in practice. This is our model. We have a detection and control system, a prevention program, and we're working on a program, and this is relatively new. We're working on reintegration. This is information and security. This is penitentiary intelligence. I'm responsible for this department. And it was set up in 2004 in the aftermath of the Madrid attacks. In 2004, we realized that prisons could be a place where inmates became radicalized. And as a matter of fact, that happened with the Madrid terrorist attacks. This department saw very few cases until 2010 or 2011 when the ISIS phenomenon became important. The first manual was drawn up in 2010. It was a manual with indicators, and we always work with indicators, detection indicators. That is, we don't have a critical mass of terrorist inmates. We have very few of them. Sometimes we don't have any at all. Right now we have a few of them. So we work with radicalization processes, and therefore we work with indicators. We assess risk levels. We have 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. But they don't depend on the crimes, but on the risk for public safety, public security. That is, there could be an environment where an inmate who's starting to be radicalized, he has 6 months left in prison, and so we monitor that inmate more closely. So we assess risk dynamically, and that's what our supervision system is based on. My department channels all the information from prisons. We analyze that information. We connect it to, that means that if we have an inmate which is a level 3 inmate and who is assessed every month, then we collect all the information provided by the prison. We analyze all his calls. We don't listen in to his calls, but we look at the phone numbers. We see whether other inmates use the same phone numbers. So we work on intelligence and analysis, and based on that information, since 2015, we coordinated that in the Proderai project, which is a project to detect Islamist radicalization. And this is done together with the regional police force. Every month, we have a coordination committee. So we have constant information. We receive constant information from the General Information Department, and this is a common program. It's not that we provide the information to the law enforcement agency and they work on it. No, the information that we exchange with the police is information that we analyze mutually, and anything that the police deem suspicious is immediately reported to us. And another issue is staff training. On this, well, we have 4,500 workers. All our workers would like to be highly specialized, but we can't turn all our workers into specialists. So we have a basic training course, 5-hour course, and 1,500 workers have already taken that course. And then we have a specialized course, a 20-hour course for intermediate officials, and over 250 intermediate officials have been trained in that specialized course. Training is aimed at making our officials familiar with radicalization, channeling information, and so on. So who is monitored? People coming to prison for terrorism, people who have been in contact with radical groups. Very often we get inmates who've committed a common crime who are being monitored by the police and who are in contact with radicals, but they are convicted for other crimes. We are told by the police force and we monitor them. We work with the regional police on this program, but we also coordinate our action with the Civil Guard and the National Police Force. We don't exclude any law enforcement agency, although mostly we work with the regional police force. And then the third element is indicators. We have a protocol to detect indicators. If we have an indicator, we look at the case, and if there are more signs, we monitor the inmate more closely. That's reassessed every so often. It's important that you know what we do from an organizational standpoint. We work with radicalization processes, and we interpret them. What do I mean? We don't rate terrorists. We are under the rule of law. Being radicalized is not a crime. Only perpetrating a crime is a crime. So at this stage, all we do is work on prevention of future actions. But in prison, as long as they don't commit a crime, we don't take any specific measures beyond monitoring and oversight. Many inmates probably know they're being monitored because they realize that the staff collects information on them, and some workers do it very well. But there are no restrictions. We fully understand the work, the way other penitentiary systems work, but this is what works for us. We don't impose limitations. And the few inmates who have been in prison for terrorism haven't had anything imposed on them. For instance, being separated or solitary confinement or anything like that. And if their family is in Barcelona, they're in a prison close to the city. All we do is enhance oversight. We constantly watch them, but we don't impose any limitations on them. And that's very important, because we've seen among young inmates who've noticed that we were watching them, we've seen that they were stigmatized, and that increased their radicalization. Right now we have the AREL program, and we work on detecting existing processes because there are signs. But the work we do, the core of our work, is to prevent, is to identify inmates who are vulnerable and who haven't yet been in contact with these radical groups. And that's what we do with the AREL program. We prevent radicalization among inmates at risk. So we try to identify vulnerable individuals who can become radicalized by Islamism or Latino gangs or far-right ideas. So the detection program, AREL, doesn't stigmatize a culture, and that's any specific culture, and that's how we see it. So we have this detection process, and our staff works at identifying vulnerability. There is a specific individual program for this inmates. We counsel them, and we design in their program modules to prevent radicalization. Let me give you an example. We have a program that welcomes inmates. Our staff is trained to detect vulnerabilities there. We have intercultural mediation programs. We have a guide to promote respect of religious activity. And we have a primary prevention system which is highly specialized, because we believe that our job will be easier if we see someone who shows signs of vulnerability, who doesn't have a social network. Well, there we start working with that person, and that makes our job easier. And we can do that because there aren't inmates who are terrorists, and we can do that because of that. Now we're working on another project, a multi-agency project, because if you're not in touch with the community, what you do in prison doesn't really make a difference. So we have a multi-agency program. We want to work with the municipality of Hospitalet and Terrassa to work on the release of level 3 inmates. So we're working on security with the local police force, and we have an inmate who we're working with right now, and there's going to be a mentorship program because we think that mentorship programs are really working for reintegration. I'm sorry I've spoken for so long. I hope you were interested. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. We're very close on time, not because of the speakers who all respected their allotted time, and I thank you very much for that. We had some questions that we inherited from the previous panel, as you all know, and we have some new questions also. Shall we receive the new questions? There's one up here. The earlier questions, I'll read them very briefly. I think they've all been answered. One was on measures proposed for working in terms of security or safety in the therapeutic area in prisons, and I think that was addressed in regard to the different countries that presented their models. And there was another question on reinsertion and rehabilitation, which I'll leave for the next table, or the next round table or panel. And there was also a question on how to overcome recidivism. And there has been comments on another question on general measures, but there is a question that I would like, that comes from Antena 3, a journalistic media. The question is, what's being done wrong in Europe in regard to jihadi prevention? And I would rephrase this: if we knew where we should be going, where should we, what would be the priority that we should be aiming at? Should we write a letter to Santa Claus or the Three Kings? What would be the priority in prevention of radicalization in Europe? I don't know if any of the panel members here would want to answer this question, and I'll take the next ones in the meantime. Okay, the next question that we will are bringing to the table, and I'll read it. What are the elements that are considered, and I don't understand the word, what work should be done when a person is in a radicalization process without falling into the basic categorizations? And I think this is what we were talking about in this last speaker. These are the two questions that we have. So any of the panel members should feel free to answer either one of these questions.
Tackle then the question on the prevention of radicalization more broadly in Europe. And my understanding then, as the moderator just agreed, is that this question was more on the prison scheme. And I think the first point that has to be acknowledged is that radicalization is something that we really and respond to radicalization. For many other countries, this is very recent. In the case of Belgium, which is the case that I know best, we really started working on radicalization, I would say, in 2013, 2014. The word was there already, actually already in the 1990s, people were talking about radicalization, but we didn't really have measures to deal with radicalization. Much more with the local communities. I think that's one of the core learning over the past few years, and that's one thing that we need to continue working on. And as a final word, I would say, and this may sound a little bit odd at this stage, but as the caliphate has fallen and as some are now already screaming victory on terrorism, we have to be a little bit careful because we've seen this in the past. We've seen this in the past that as the terrorist threat was waning, as it is happening today, and Belgium has lowered its threat level earlier this year, just to point that out. As the terrorist threat is waning, there is a strong temptation to divest and push resources away and towards other priorities. And God knows there's quite a lot of priorities these days beyond terrorism. And this we have called counterterrorism fatigue. This is something that we have seen in the late 2000s. And unfortunately, I think the field of prevention of radicalization might be and will be one of the first victims of this counterterrorism fatigue if this is happening again. And I do sometimes hear the early signs of it, but this is not probably this varies from one service to another, from one country to another, but we have to be very careful to this. And well, that would be my warning here. Continue working on this.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Un minuto por ahí.
Thank you. One more minute. I'll answer the second questions. One of the elements, the key elements about how to work with individuals in a process of radicalization, not to stigmatize them, is a question we ask ourselves a lot in our working groups in how to deal with these programs. Currently, we believe that the way we're going to approach this, and this is what we've chosen so far, we've been working with detection and monitoring, and we'd like to go on to work with reintegration programs of inmates subject to radicalization. We have to be able to certify that they've been radicalized. So here it has a lot to do with mentoring, seek an element in the community or in a multi-agency group who is in harmony with the environment. This is classical in all of the different environments of crime. The best programs are the ones in which the inmate, that there is an appropriate link created with the integration program this is the model that we're working with and on in jihadist de-radicalization process. We want to work with mentors from the Muslim environment, and we're working with the local communities so that they can advise us who would be the best mentors in this regard. In regard to this same issue, we work with, and I referred to this in my presentation, we work with a series of indicators that where we don't stigmatize inmates if we only find one of these indicators present or just a few. But these indicators do alert us to this inmate to focus our attention and our human resources through to be able to carry out more monitoring. And so the inmates may be showing indications of participation in incidents of a religious nature. They may be seeking to lead religious service groups or prayer groups in addition to what we offer, and also we may detect the presence of an element or a material that has extremist or religious content, and we kind of focus on these, we try to separate these elements and be able to focus on this person to be able to determine whether or not to include them in a group that would require more attention or control. Thank you to the 4 speakers and for this very interesting morning. The report that was presented, the program on global terrorism, it's now available on the website. And thank you very much to the 4 speakers who have told us about their models, their actions, their ideas, the implementation of the actions that they are undertaking right now. We'll see you after lunch at 4 p.m. Thank you very much.